Good day and welcome to COTK Online. My name is Hannah Nell and I serve as the youth pastor here at Church of the King. Today, I want to invite you to get connected. If it's your first, second, 10th, or 100th time that you are watching COTK Online, I want to invite you to get connected in the spiritual family. You can do that by filling out the Connect card on our website or using the link down in the description box below. Today, I would also like to say thank you so much for your generosity. I want to thank you for sowing your money into God's kingdom and trusting Him and see what He can do globally and locally. Today, you can give by texting the number available on the screen. You can also use our website or our app. Thank you and enjoy today's word.
Welcome to COTK Online. Happy Palm Sunday to everybody. We're going to talk about that in just a moment, but we are in the middle of our relationship series called Uncommon Relationships. And the fact of the matter is that the quality of our lives are determined by the quality of our relationships. What's another fact, and it's not necessarily a good one, is that while great relationships are possible, they're really not probable unless you're willing to do the hard work, which is why over the last 3 weeks, we've been talking about uncommon love, that love isn't something that you simply receive. You have to give first, but how can you give what you've never received? So the first thing that we must do is receive love from God and recognize that just like in John 3:16, for God so loved the world that He gave, when we receive that love, then we're able to give. That was week 1. Week 2 is uncommon commitment, where we're called to be the right person, to become the person who's committed first to the Lord, second to the people in our lives. And then last week, which was uncommon communication. You know, one of my life verses is Jeremiah 29:11, where God speaks to us and He says, He's actually speaking to the nation of Israel. And He says, I know the plans that I have for you, not for calamity and destruction, but to give you a future and a hope. And those words of hope and life really need to be the primary words that we use in the relationships that we have with the people around us, even when they're at their worst. Just as in Jeremiah 29, if you go read, that God was speaking the hope and the life that could come. And that's the same for us, that we have an uncommon love in our life that we first received from the Lord and are able to give, that there's an uncommon commitment that we are choosing to be the right person, so that we know that as we're conformed to the image of Christ, that we can be someone who is committed even when it's difficult. And then uncommon communication. And of course, this whole series is founded on Romans 12. It says, don't copy the behavior and the customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way that you think. Then you'll learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. You know, my heart for you is that you grow into the person that God created you to be. And part of that is having healthy relationships. Completely understand that I cannot transform the people around me. But as I allow God to transform the way that I think and I'm conformed to His image, my relationships will transform as well. And they'll head in the right direction. And I want the story of your life to be one of transformation, one of redemption, where even the bad things that you've experienced are turned around for good. That's a Romans 8:28 life, where we know that all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to His purpose. And when you choose His purpose and His ways, there's transformation that comes first to you, then to the people and the world around you, because you've encountered the one who brings transformation. So here's the questions that I have for you today. There's a few. Here's the first one. What's the story of your life? What is it? What's the story of you? Have you ever told your story to people? Actually, I sat with someone today and we told each other our life stories because we really met for the first time. And so I wanted to find out, hey man, what's your story? And he was like, hey man, tell me about you. And I got to tell the story of my life. Ended up being a fairly long meeting, but it was a very good one and a rich one because we were getting to know one another. What's the story of your life? Because the story of your life ultimately will determine the relationships and the quality of the relationships that you have, which leads me to the next question. What's the story of your relationships? How are they? Who are the people in your life? What are they like? Why are they there? Are you growing with them? Are you growing to be like them? Are they growing to be like you? This is a big deal. And I think sometimes that we don't realize what we have when it's right in front of us. One of my favorite stories is one that I'm going to read in just a moment. It's a really interesting story, and it's all about perspective, because my heart for you today is to be able to see. We're going to talk about Palm Sunday and about Jesus's triumphal entry, but I think it's fitting that we recognize that sometimes there are great things that are right in front of us, but we don't necessarily see them clearly. So I'm going to read this story. It's called The Fisherman's Story. An American investment banker was at the pier of a small coastal Mexican village when a small boat with just one fisherman docked. Inside the small boat were several large yellowfin tuna, and the American complimented the Mexican on the quality of his fish and asked how long it took to catch them. The Mexican replied, "Only a little while." The American then asked, why didn't he stay out longer and catch more fish? The Mexican said that he had enough to support his family's immediate needs. The American asked, "But what do you do with the rest of your time?" The Mexican fisherman said, "I sleep late, I fish a little, I play with my children, I take siestas with my wife, Maria. I stroll into the village each evening where I sip wine, play guitar with my amigos. I have a full and busy life." The American scoffed. "I'm a Harvard MBA and I could help you. You should spend more time fishing, and with the proceeds, you could buy a bigger boat. And with the proceeds from the bigger boat, you could buy several more boats. Eventually, you'd have a fleet of fishing boats, and instead of selling your catch to a middleman, you'd sell directly to the processor, eventually opening your own cannery. You'd control the product, the processing, and the distribution. You'd need to leave this small coastal fishing village and move to Mexico City, then LA, and eventually New York." The Mexican fisherman asked, "How long will all that take?" The American replied, 15 to 20 years. "But what then?" the Mexican said. The American laughed and said, "That's the best part. When the time is right, you'd announce an IPO and sell your company stock to the public and become very, very rich. You'd make millions." "Millions? Well, then what?" said the Mexican. The American said, "Then you'd retire. You'd move to a small coastal fishing village where you'd sleep late, fish a little, play with your kids, take siestas with your wife, stroll to the village in the evenings where you could sip wine and play guitar with your amigos." What's the point? Sometimes the things that we've wanted all along are right in front of us. We just don't have the right perspective. And today, I hope that you have the right perspective on life and relationship. The title of today's message is Uncommon Surrender, and it's fitting that it's Palm Sunday. See, Palm Sunday is about the moment when Jesus enters Jerusalem. It's just a few days before his crucifixion, and Jesus knows what's coming. In fact, he's been telling his disciples over and over, "I'm going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to die." But they don't get it. They can't see clearly. They're like the American in the story. They're looking at things wrongly, and they don't see the simplicity that is before them that will bring about tremendous life through Jesus. But Jesus knows. And so he's going up to Jerusalem. He's been staying with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. He's already raised Lazarus from the dead, and because of this, he's very well known because people knew Lazarus, they knew he died, and they knew Jesus raised him from the dead. So as he goes up into Jerusalem in preparation to celebrate Passover, the celebration of the nation of Israel being delivered from slavery in Egypt by the hand of God, he's going up to Jerusalem. And while he's entering, and before he enters, he tells his disciples, "Hey, go to such and such place. You're going to find a donkey that's tied. I want you to untie it and bring it to me, and I will ride the donkey into Jerusalem." And he does this. But the city has heard that Jesus, this prophet that raises people from the dead is entering into Jerusalem, and they begin to whisper, and then it turns into rumors, and now there's just this undertone of celebration in the city as they think the Messiah, and they're right in thinking that, is coming. In John 12 through 18, we see Jesus entering the city to celebrate Passover, and what a buzz was around him. It says, the next day, the news that Jesus was on the way to Jerusalem swept through the city. A large crowd of Passover visitors took palm branches and went down the road to meet him, and they shouted, "Praise God, blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hail to the King of Israel." They thought that Jesus was coming to be crowned the king. Remember, they're under Roman rule. They're oppressed, and they're going, the Messiah is coming. He's going to deliver us from the Roman oppressor. In verse 14, it says, Jesus found a young donkey, and he rode on it, fulfilling the prophecy that said, "Don't be afraid, people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming, riding on a donkey's colt." And Jesus was coming as the king, but he wasn't coming as the king that people thought. Jesus was not coming to be a political ruler, but to break the curse of sin so that people could walk in freedom from it. Verse 16, it says, his disciples didn't understand at the time that this was fulfillment of prophecy. But after Jesus entered into his glory, they remembered what had happened and realized that those things that had been written about him. Many in the crowd had seen Jesus call Lazarus from the tomb, rising from the dead, and they were telling others about it. I love verse 18. It says, that was the reason that so many went out to meet him, because they had heard about his miraculous sign. They knew that this was a man that performed miracles. They believed that he was a prophet. They believed that he was the Messiah, but they didn't understand that he was much more than simply the one who would deliver them from political oppression. In fact, that wasn't what he was doing at all. He was freeing them from the oppression that truly mattered. And in this story, I can't help but look at the conflict, the contrast between the people over here. They're like celebrating. Jesus is coming and he's the king, but their perspective isn't right. They don't see the situation clearly. They understand that Jesus is a king, but what they don't see is that he's coming for their heart and their soul. So they're celebrating. This is the Messiah who's going to deliver us, but they get the deliverance all wrong. They're celebrating, and we don't see anything about Jesus celebrating at all. I don't think he was, because he had previously said, I'm going to Jerusalem and I know what awaits me. He knew what was going to happen. For him, it wasn't a moment of celebration. It was a moment of surrender. And the fact of the matter is that the story of our lives, the story of our relationships, yes, they should be one of uncommon love, uncommon commitment, uncommon communication. But the truth is they should be one, both the story of our lives and the story of our relationships, of uncommon surrender. I have a degree in English. I've done a little bit of journalism. One of the things that I realized when you're telling a story, and this is taught the highest levels of education, when you're telling a story, you have to focus on the 5 W's and the H. And you have to let people know about the what, when, where, why, who, and how. And I want us to look at this picture on Palm Sunday, Jesus entering and people laying down their cloaks in the road, putting palm branches in front of the donkey that Jesus was riding on, saying, "Hail to the King, hail to the King." They're celebrating. But less than a week later, the same crowd is crying, "Crucify him." How could this be? Because they didn't have the right perspective and they didn't understand uncommon surrender. Yet Jesus lived it out. He knew that he was not going for a celebration. He was going to surrender to the will of the Father, to lay his life down as a sacrifice. How did Jesus surrender? Well, those 5 W's and that H, Jesus walked that out and lived that out as an example to us and how we should have an uncommon surrender to God and other people. What did Jesus surrender? And going up to Jerusalem, knowing that he would be betrayed, knowing that he would be arrested, falsely accused, convicted of a crime he never committed, tortured, humiliated, put on a cross to die. At the Garden of Gethsemane, just outside of Jerusalem, we see Jesus' prayer of surrendering the what to the Father. In Luke 22:42, he says, "Father, if you're willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine." What are we called to surrender in our lives and in our relationships? Our will. Lord, I don't want my will to be done in my relationships. I want your will to be done. Are you surrendering your relationships to the will of the Father? Can I tell you right now, the reason that so many young people miss it relationally is because they choose their will rather than saying, Father, is this the person that I'm supposed to be hanging out with? Is this the person that I'm supposed to be committed to? Is this the person that I'm supposed to be dating? Because they want what they want and their will. And I can't throw stones because I've been there too. But I want you to understand that the quality of your life is determined by your relationships. The foundation of an uncommon surrender of your will is necessary. And Jesus led the way. Palm Sunday was celebration for everyone but Jesus because he knew what he was doing, that he would have to surrender his will. That was his what? The when. Father, please, if there's any other way, I don't want to go through this. I know what's about to happen. He surrendered his timing. I have learned I don't pray for patience. I've learned that because every time I prayed for patience, God never gave it to me. He simply gave me the opportunity to be patient so that I could learn his time is way more important than my timing. His timing. Jesus had to give up the what, his will, the when, the timing of the Father. I have such a clear picture of Jesus in my mind at the Garden of Gethsemane. If there's any other way, Lord, do I have to do this now? Father, do I have to do this now? But not my will, yours be done. And it's in that next moment that Judas shows up because Jesus gave up his will. He surrendered that to the will of the Father. He surrendered his timing to that of the Father. And for those of you that your relationships are not in the place that you want them to be, trust the Lord. Trust the Lord. Don't become impatient. Don't think to yourself, it will never happen, or it's already happened and it will never happen again. Surrender to his timing, not your own. The what, the when, the where, his placement. His placement. I need uncommon surrender surrenders every aspect. Your will, your timing, your placement. In fact, I'm in the place that I told the Lord, I don't want to be here. And yet God placed me here divinely. And it's been amazing because his way is always more fulfilling than ours. His placement is more fulfilling. The why. What's your motivation? Why? Why are you doing what you're doing? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Have you ever been in a relationship and said, why am I so frustrated in this? Those are good questions. But the greater question is, Lord, what do you have for me? What do you see? Is my motivation surrendered to you? Do I want my fulfillment, or do I want your plan to become my reality? Now we can say, yes, Lord, I want your plan to be my reality. And yet if there's this struggle there just is well, I have my own reasons, surrender that to the Lord. Jesus did all of this. As I was preparing and praying for this, the contrast of what the people said, oh, you're the king, but they didn't see it clearly. They were celebrating, but Jesus was in the middle of a difficult surrender. That's necessary for us in our spiritual walk and in our relationships. I have to surrender to the will of the Father. And if I'm in a healthy relationship, there's going to be areas and times and moments where I'm going to have to surrender my will and my motivation and my timing, my placement, the who. Every good story that's being told in written format or verbal format, it's the what, when, where, the why, and the who. Jesus had to surrender up his people. In fact, on the cross, he looks at John, the only disciple who is still with him. He says, John, look at your mother, looks at his mother and says, Mom, look at your son. He's lay on people into the hands of the Lord. I'll tell you how many parents and young adults and sometimes grown adults and older adults even, that they will come to the place where they say, I realize I have to surrender them to the Lord. I have to trust that God has them in his hands. And here's the fact of the matter. To think that you have people in your hands. I've got 4 kids. My oldest is 20. My youngest is 13. They are my children. And my 13, let's look at my youngest. Yeah, he's mine and I'm responsible for him. But one of the disciplines that my wife and I have to consistently and regularly engage in is at night. She knows I'm going to grab her hand. We're going to pray in bed and we're going to surrender all of our children to the Lord. If you want healthy relationships, you need to surrender your people to the Lord. Your will, your timing, your placement, your motivation, and your people to the Lord. The what, when, where, why, who, and then lastly, the how. Jesus surrendered the how. He surrendered his way. That Luke 22, 42, Father, please take this cup of suffering away from me. Jesus didn't want the Father's way in that moment. He begged any other way, but he ended it with, yet I want your will to be done, not mine. Am I willing to pray that in my life and my relationships? I'll be honest, this is probably the hardest, the most stern of all of the messages on relationships, because we are called to surrender first our life. Just as Jesus laid down his life for you and for me, we are to surrender our lives to the Father as well. And then in a healthy relationship, we should feel safe and secure in understanding that if I am in a committed, lifelong relationship with someone like my spouse, like my wife, I'm called to lay down my life for her and her for me. This is what makes it healthy. I have to lay down my will and my way. This is what Jesus did for you and for me. Are you willing to lay down your life for God and other people? This doesn't mean that you're a doormat. This doesn't mean that you're subjecting yourself to abuse. It means you're surrendering to the will of God, and that is not always easy. I'll go back to uncommon commitment, the second week, where we're called to become the right person. The right person is one who, like Jesus, they're in contrast with the culture of the day, where everybody's celebrating. Jesus is painfully surrendering. And for us to be in this world, but not conformed to it, instead transformed, because we have surrendered to the will of the Lord. Our relationships transform when we surrender to each other, but our story changes when we surrender our life to the Father. How is this a relationship message? Because when we surrender all to him, we become the person that he created us to be. And in that moment of surrender that is lived out day by day, we're transformed by the renewing of our mind because we're walking in the Spirit and walking by faith, not by what everybody else sees. That's my prayer for you. Are you surrendered in your heart, your soul, your life, and your relationships to the will of the Father? Are you living His way or your way? My prayer for you is that you can live His way, because when you trust God with every aspect of your life, it transforms your relationship and it changes your story. I so want that for you. Father, I just pray right now for those that are listening to my voice, that Lord, that they may be in the middle of relational upheaval, relational chaos and craziness. Father, I just pray that they can see right now that it's you that brings transformation, but what is dependent on them is the act of surrender. So maybe that's you, and there's some areas in your life. Maybe you need to surrender everything to the Lord. You haven't done that. Maybe you've held back a relationship. Give it to Him. Maybe you're struggling with a family member or a friend or a child, and you need to surrender them to Him. Stop trying to fix it yourself. You cannot fix that person. All you can do is surrender. So Father, I just pray that as they open their hands and their hearts to you, in those relationships, that you bring healing and wholeness to them, and that, Father, that they surrender everything to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Love you guys. Listen, if God's dealing with you, reach out. Let us know so that we can connect you with relationships and resources to help you grow. God bless.